Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is nonverbal communication. It's not what you say, but it's how you say it. There's scientific body of knowledge that nonverbal communication is providing many fascinating and valuable clues to human behavior. So if non means not, and verbal means with words, then it would be logical that nonverbal communication would be just communication without words. This definition is definitely an oversimplification because it fails to distinguish between vocal communication by your mouth and verbal communication with words. Some nonverbal messages have a vocal element. For example, the words "I love you" have a whole bunch of different meanings depending on the way they're spoken, who they're spoken to, who is speaking them to you. A better definition of nonverbal communication is messages expressed by non-linguistic means. Psychologists claim that 93% of the emotional impact of a message comes from the nonverbal source. So only 7% is the verbal part of it. So guys, when you're worried about what you're going to say to the girl, your words are only 7%. Non-verbally, it's 93% how you're saying these words. Nonverbal communication contributes a great deal to shaping our perceptions. You remember a time when you're at a party or you're with a group of people that you don't know and all of a sudden they're speaking in a different language. You don't understand what they're saying, but it's likely that you got clues about the idea of what's going on. That from their facial expressions, from their posture, their gestures, their vocal tones, other behaviors, you can make assumptions that this is a funny story they're telling or this is something that's really sad. Researchers have found that subjects who hear content-free speech, ordinary speech that has been electronically manipulated, can constantly recognize the emotions being expressed as well as identify its strength. So some characteristics of nonverbal communication: all behavior has communicative value. You cannot not communicate. You're always communicating. You understand it's impossible to not communicate. Even if somebody said, okay, I want you not to communicate, and you just sat there and didn't say anything or do anything, you're still sending a message. Even if you leave the room, you just sent a message. So you're always communicating. You can't turn it off. Each of us has a kind of a transmitter. It just doesn't shut off no matter what we do. We send out messages that say something about ourselves, our relationship with others, how we're feeling, what we think, all those things. Even uncontrollable behaviors can convey a message. When you blush, you send a message. When you smile, when you smirk, you just send a message. Even if it's not intentional, it's a message and it can be interpreted, whether correctly or incorrectly. But whether or not your behavior is intentional and whether or not it's interpreted accurately, all nonverbal behavior has the potential to create a message. And our nonverbal communication is primarily relational. Some nonverbal messages serve practical functions. When the police are at a corner because the lights are out and they're directing traffic and they're telling you to go or stop, kind of thing like that, that's nonverbal messages that are functional. But most of ours have something to do with relationships. Well, the way relationships we have or want to have with other people. So just think of how you greet people. Some people you greet with just a hi. Some people you're like, oh, I'm so happy you're hugging them. Some people you just give them a nod on the head. Some you shake your head. All those things. Some you wink at, who knows, kind of thing. But each of these behaviors sends a message about the nature of the relationship with that other person. Our nonverbal communication is also ambiguous. Most nonverbal behavior has the potential to be more ambiguous than verbal statements. Because it's so ambiguous, caution is wise when you're responding to nonverbal clues. And nonverbal communication even occurs in mediated messages over the computer. Smiley faces are nonverbal communication. How many explanation points you use is a nonverbal communication. How many dots is a nonverbal communication. Not only does the content of a nonverbal message matter, but when it's sent matters. So when somebody sends you a text message and you look at it and you put it down, you just sent a message. But that's not that important. And they're looking, it's like, oh, why aren't they texting me back? And then you're like, oh, sorry, you just saw this. That's a lie, you know that. But you've sent a message that, yeah, your messages aren't that important. I'm not jumping just because you've texted me. Nonverbal communication is influenced by culture and gender. Some nonverbal behaviors are called emblems, and they're culturally understood for verbal expressions, like nodding your head, yes. But remember that these are depend on where you're from. So like in the United States, your thumb up, that's a good job. But in Germany, a thumb up is one more. Like if you're at a bar and the bartender looks at you, go like this, you get another beer, kind of thing. In Japan, if you do this, it's the number 5, because five kind of thing. So be careful how you're ordering, right? Smiles and laughter are universal signals of positive emotions, whereas sour expressions convey displeasure in almost every culture. When we examine the behavior of children that are born deaf and blind, despite their lack of social language, these children display a broad range of expressions. They still smile, they still laugh, they cry in virtually the same ways as seeing and hearing infants. And although some nonverbal expressions may be universal, the way they're used varies widely around the world. In some cultures, overt demonstrations of feelings such as happiness or anger are discouraged. In other cultures, the same feelings are perfectly appropriate. Japanese people might appear much more non-verbally controlled, whereas Italian people, in fact, let their feelings out all the time. Gender also influences nonverbal communication, and with rare exceptions, differences between gender holds true across cultures. In general, females are more nonverbally expressive than males. Females smile more, use more facial expressions, use more but less expansive head, arm, and hand gestures, touch others more, stand closer to each other, are more vocally expressive, and make more eye contact. Despite these differences, men and women's nonverbal communication patterns have a great deal in common. So women, talk is very important. Guys, in case you haven't noticed this, right? And women will say, we need to talk. Because it is a need they have. They need to talk through things. Guys are like, oh yeah, let's talk about this. Women are like, no, we need to talk about this. It's way more important. And they want to be face to face when they do this. So some functions of nonverbal communication: it creates and maintains relationships. Communication is our primary means for beginning, maintaining, and ending relationships, and the nonverbal parts of it plays a really important role in this whole thing. It also regulates interaction. It helps us control when we know it's time to talk and when we know it's not. There are 3 nonverbal signals that indicate a speaker has finished talking and is ready to yield to the listeners. There's a change in the vocal intonation, a rising or falling in pitch at the end of a clause, a drawl on the last syllable, or a drop in vocal pitch or loudness when speaking, like you know. Eye contact is another way of regulating verbal communication. In conversations, the person listening typically looks more at the speaker than the reverse. When the speaker seeks a response, they signal by looking at the listener, creating a brief period of mutual gaze called a gaze window. At this point, the listener is likely to respond with a nod, something like that, because that just shows that you are listening. Nonverbal also influences others. The way we look, act, sound can be more important in a meeting our goals than the words we speak. Sometimes deliberately and sometimes without thought, we use nonverbal behaviors in ways that get others to satisfy our wants and needs. People are more willing to do what we want when we look at them directly in the eye, when we wear high status clothing, when we use open body gestures, when we touch them, when we behave in a friendly, upbeat manner. That's why job seekers are coached to offer a firm handshake, smile often and genuinely, and help influence employers to hire them. So when we were kids, my dad, I remember this, I don't know how many weeks it seemed like, he took us all in the backyard to practice shaking hands. Shaking hands like a man. Stick your hand off, shake your hand. No, not like a fish. Stick your hand like that. And my dad was a salesman. He went around and met people all the time and shook hands all the time. That was his thing. I remember we had a guest preacher once at church, and I remember looking at my dad during the sermon. My dad's like shaking his head, kind of thing. I'm like, oh, this guy must be really good, right? We leave the church, shake hands, we leave. My dad gets in the car, and before he even starts the car, he goes, well, I hope he never comes back. I'm like, looking at him like, I thought you liked him. You were like all shaking your head and stuff like that. And my dad goes, shakes hands like a dead fish. And because of that, he didn't like him, right? So nonverbal also can conceal and deceive. We value truth and honor, but sometimes we use nonverbal when we pretend to be having a good time at a family celebration or a business event, even though we're bored. You know, in situations like this, it's easy to see how nonverbal factors can make a face-saving deception either successful or fail. When verbal and nonverbal messages conflict, we tend to believe the nonverbal. That's why most people monitor and self-monitor nonverbal clues. Their facial expressions, eye contact, posture, voice, pitch, rate, all these things, because we will believe the nonverbal. You know how many times it's just like, oh yeah, she said she liked him, but she doesn't, right? We just know that. But as we look at this scientifically, we're accurate in detecting deception only slightly more than half the time. So really, if we flipped a coin, it'd be just as good. And we overestimate our ability to detect others' lies. We're not as good as catching people as we think we are. And we have a strong tendency to judge others' messages as truthful. We want to believe that people are telling us the truth. These principles serve as a reminder that it's not easy to determine when somebody's lying, and nonverbal clues aren't a dead giveaway. Conventional wisdom suggests that liars avert our gaze and fidget more, but research shows just the opposite. Research shows that liars often sustain more eye contact and fidget less, in part because they believe that if they do that, they're going to look deceitful. And they also make more eye contact to help them determine if the other person is really believing what they're saying. It also, nonverbal communication helps manage our impressions. You know, our impression is an important part of thing in impression management we talked about in chapter 3, getting others to view us the way we want to be seen. You know, if you're invited next weekend to a party in LA or a party in Beverly Hills for Halloween, you know, what you wear is going to be an important thing, and that's part of the nonverbal behavior. All right, catch me in part 2. I'll be right there.